The forest was silent that night, except for the sound of something breathing just outside the tent. I lay still, hands folded over my chest, listening. The nylon walls pressed close on every side, faintly tacky with sap where I'd brushed against a tree while pitching camp. Cold seeped up through the ground sheet and into my spine. Somewhere beyond the thin zipper seam, the forest exhaled. It wasn't loud. That was what made it worse. A measured sound, air drawn in, held, then released, slow enough to suggest intent. Too steady for wind, too close to be anything moving through undergrowth. It came from a place just beyond where my eyes would reach if the tent were suddenly gone. I counted my own breaths to make sure the sound wasn't mine. In through the nose, out through the mouth. My lungs rasped faintly, dry from the hike. The other breathing continued, unbothered, a fraction of a second behind mine, as if listening. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet earlier in the evening. No insects ticking, no distant owl calls. Even the trees seemed to have stiffened, branches held in a waiting posture. I remembered thinking it felt like a theater just before the curtain rose. Air heavy, the audience hushed. I told myself that forests did that sometimes. That silence didn't mean absence. It meant I was paying attention. Now, attention felt like a mistake. The smell of damp earth pressed through the tent fabric, rich and metallic. My fingertips traced the seam above my head, following the path of the stitching. The nylon was warm where my breath touched it, cool everywhere else. Each time the outside sound exhaled, the tent wall fluttered almost imperceptibly, as if brushed by a passing body. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. They were known to approach camps, curious, unafraid. But deer snorted and stamped. Bears huffed and shuffled. This was neither. This was patient. This was close enough that I could imagine the heat of it, the shape of a ribcage rising and falling inches from my face. I reached for my headlamp, then stopped. Light would make the darkness real. It would force whatever was there into a shape, and I wasn't sure I wanted that. In the dark, it could still be anything. In the dark, it could still be nothing. The breathing paused. My heart hammered loud enough that I was sure it would hear it. The pause stretched, a held lungful of air that made my own chest ache in sympathy. I waited for the release. Instead, something shifted. A soft drag along the ground, like fabric pulled over needles. The sound traveled from one side of the tent to the other, slow and deliberate. I imagined fingers trailing along the nylon, learning its shape. "Hello," I said, the word thin and useless. The forest did not answer. The breathing resumed, closer now, as if whoever or whatever had leaned in to listen. I thought of the trail map folded in my pack, the red line tracing a loop I hadn't meant to finish in one day. I thought of the ranger station I'd passed hours ago, shuttered and dark. I thought of how the trees had grown denser with each mile, trunks crowding together, their bark scarred and flaking like old skin. There were places where the trail markers had vanished entirely, where I'd followed instinct instead of signs. The breathing matched my pace when I tried to slow my own. It mirrored me, a perfect echo, until I couldn't tell which rhythm belonged to which body. Panic prickled along my arms. I held my breath. So did it. The silence pressed down, absolute. My lungs burned. I waited for the inevitable inhale from outside, proof that the sound wasn't mine. Seconds dragged. Spots bloomed behind my eyes. When I finally gasped, the forest gasped with me, air rushing in from beyond the tent wall, greedy and wet. I slapped the headlamp on. Light flooded the nylon, turning it into a glowing skin. Shadows leapt and twisted where branches pressed close. I stared at the place the breathing should be, heart in my throat. There was nothing there. No outline, no movement, just the pale curve of the tent wall and the black suggestion of trees beyond. The breathing continued, now diffuse, everywhere and nowhere at once. It seemed to come from the ground itself, from the roots and soil beneath me. I killed the light, suddenly afraid of what I might see if I left it on too long. The sound softened, settling into the background like a memory. I lay back, exhausted, telling myself I was dehydrated, overtired, that the forest was full of sounds that the mind tried to organize into patterns, that fear made narrators of us all. Sleep came in fragments. Each time I drifted, the breathing grew louder, pulling me back to the surface. In one half-dream, I was outside the tent, standing among the trees, listening to my own body breathe inside. In another, the tent was gone, and I was wrapped in leaves, the forest's lungs working through me. At some point, I realized the breathing was no longer outside. It was inside the tent, filling the small space, fogging the air. The walls bowed in and out, subtle but unmistakable, as if the tent itself had developed a chest. Each inhale drew the fabric tight against the poles. Each exhale let it sag. My own breath felt shallow by comparison, inadequate. I pressed my palm against the wall. It moved beneath my touch, alive with motion. "No," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was denying. The zipper was inches from my hand. I could open it. I could step out and see what the forest wanted from me. The idea felt both terrifying and inevitable, like reaching the last page of a book you didn't want to end. The breathing slowed, deepened. It felt older now, heavier, like something that had been inhaling and exhaling long before I arrived and would continue long after I was gone. With each breath, the scent of the forest intensified. Mushrooms and rot and green life pressing up through decay. A thought surfaced, unbidden. I was not being watched. I was being learned. Dawn came gray and thin, light seeping through the trees like a reluctant confession. The breathing faded with it, dissolving into the ordinary sounds of morning. Birds began to call, tentative at first, then bolder. The forest relaxed. I lay still for a long time, afraid to move, afraid that motion would bring it back. When I finally sat up, the tent was still. Just fabric and poles. Just me. Outside, the ground was soft with needles. My pack sat where I'd left it. No tracks circled the tent. No disturbed earth. I laughed, a brittle sound, and began to break camp. It wasn't until I rolled the tent that I noticed the inside smelled wrong. Stale. Heavy. Like breath trapped too long in a closed room. The ground beneath where I'd slept was damp, darker than the surrounding soil. I stood there, staring as understanding crept in sideways. The forest hadn't been breathing outside my tent. It had been breathing through me. All night, as I lay still and listened, my lungs had synced with the slow, vast respiration of the woods. Each breath I took had fed something larger, something patient that used my body as a bellows, drawing air down into the soil and roots and waiting dark. When I shouldered my pack and stepped back onto the trail, the trees leaned closer, leaves trembling with quiet satisfaction. Behind me, in the place where the tent had stood, the ground rose and fell once more on its own. A strange symbol carved into a nearby tree wasn't there when the campers first arrived. I was the one who noticed it first, which is why the others eventually decided it was my fault. Morning light filtered through the canopy in thin, uneven shafts, turning the forest floor into a patchwork of gold and shadow. Dew clung to the ferns and soaked through my boots as I stepped away from the fire pit, following the edge of the clearing to relieve myself. The air smelled of wet bark and last night's smoke, sharp and mineral. That's when I saw it. The tree stood just beyond the ring of trampled earth, a tall cedar with bark like layered scales. The symbol was carved chest-high, fresh enough that pale wood still showed through the darker outer skin. It wasn't deep, but it was deliberate lines cut with steady pressure, not hacked or scratched. The shape twisted in on itself, looping angles that suggested symmetry until you looked too long, and then it didn't. It made my eyes want to slide away. I stared at it, trying to remember if I'd seen it before. We'd arrived late the previous afternoon, pitch tense while daylight bled out of the woods. I remembered leaning against that tree while tightening a guy line, feeling the rough bark through my sleeve. There had been nothing there. "Hey!" I called back toward camp. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. "Did one of you carve this?" Footsteps approached. Claire squinted at the mark, brushing damp hair from her face. Jonah came up behind her, coffee steaming in his hand. Marcus hung back, already uneasy. He'd been like that since the drive-in, glancing at the forest like it was something that might move when he wasn't looking. "No," Claire said slowly. "That's not funny." "I didn't do it," Jonah said. "And you know I wouldn't carve some Blair Witch nonsense." The word hung there, unwanted. The forest answered with a distant creak, wood shifting against wood. Marcus leaned in close enough to smell the sap. "That's recent," he said. "See how light it is?" A breeze moved through the branches overhead. For a moment, it felt like the tree itself was breathing, expanding and settling around the wound in its bark. We laughed it off eventually. Someone suggested a local messing with us. Someone else said maybe we'd missed it the night before. The explanations were thin, but they were better than the alternative. By noon, the symbol had been folded into the background of the trip. Another story to tell later. Except I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I turned my head, I expected to see it somewhere else. Carved into another trunk, traced in shadow on the ground, lingering in the afterimage when I blinked. The lines were too clean, too intentional. They reminded me of something I almost recognized, like a word on the tip of my tongue. That afternoon, while the others hiked down to the creek, I stayed behind, claiming a headache. The clearing felt different without voices, too open and too exposed. The forest pressed closer at the edges, leaves whispering in a language just shy of meaning. I went back to the cedar. Up close, the symbol made my skin prickle. The grooves were smooth, the wood inside faintly damp, as if the tree hadn't decided how to heal yet. I traced one line with my finger and flinched at the cold. Sap clung to my skin, sticky and dark. Something shifted beneath my touch. Not movement exactly, more like resistance, as if the bark tightened around the shape, acknowledging me. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, and laughed at myself. Trees didn't respond. Forests didn't notice people. That was the comfort of nature. Its indifference. That night, the symbol appeared again. Claire found it first this time, carved into a beech on the far side of the clearing. Same shape, same size, same pale, exposed wood. She swore she'd walked past that tree a dozen times already. "Nope," Jonah said, too fast. "Absolutely not." Marcus didn't speak. He was staring into the dark beyond the firelight, jaw clenched, as if listening for something just out of range. The forest was loud then. Whined through needles, insects droning, something heavy shifting deeper in the trees. The sounds layered over each other until it was impossible to tell what was normal and what wasn't. The fire popped, sparks snapping upward like tiny signals. We argued. Accusations surfaced and were immediately denied. Jokes curdled before they landed. I felt the symbol behind my eyes, the way its lines folded and refold, patient. By the third carving, no one laughed. It was on a tree near Marcus's tent, low and partially hidden by shadow. He hadn't left camp all day. None of us had knives sharp enough to cut that cleanly. "I think it's marking something," Claire whispered. "Or someone," Jonah said. They all looked at me then. I hadn't meant to stand so close to the tree. I hadn't even noticed myself moving. The night stretched thin. Sleep came in brief, feverish patches. Each time I woke, I thought I heard wood being cut. Not the violent chop of an axe, but the careful scrape of a blade guided by memory. I dreamed of lines carving themselves into the inside of my skull. By morning, the symbol was everywhere. Not carved, reflected. In the way branches crossed overhead. In the cracks of drying mud. In the negative space between stones. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The forest arranged itself around the shape, or maybe it always had, and I was only just learning how to look. The others packed in silence. Marcus's hands shook so badly he dropped his tent poles twice. Claire wouldn't meet my eyes. Jonah kept glancing at me like he was afraid I might say something he didn't want to hear. I wanted to tell them it wasn't a threat. Not exactly. I wanted to tell them the symbol felt less like a warning and more like an opening. When I touched the cedar again, the bark was warm. Understanding came slowly, settling into place with a sick, inevitable calm. The symbol wasn't a message left by something passing through. It was a boundary, a doorframe, a way of telling the forest where I ended and it began, or where that distinction stopped mattering. The others left without me. They said I insisted on staying, that I was calm in a way that scared them. I don't remember the argument. I remember the trees leaning in, their shadows aligning just right. The last symbol wasn't carved into bark at all. It bloomed under my skin, lines aching into place along my arms and chest, invisible but unmistakable. When I pressed my palm to the trunk, the forest answered, not with words, but with recognition. I hadn't discovered the symbol. The forest had remembered me.